right. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate the opportunity. Unfortunately, I don't know if Kip mentioned earlier, but I had some flight challenges yesterday. I would have been there in person. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get onto my connecting flight, and so therefore we're having to do this virtually. So I apologize for that. I was really looking forward to being there in person. But we'll continue on with the presentation. And to follow up on Mark's presentation there, I think he did an excellent job, and he's actually hit on a few things that I'll be talking about here today. So again, we're going to talk about prescribed fire and how that can be used to enhance wild turkey habitat. Let's see if I can, there we go. All right. First, I wanted to briefly mention about my lab here at the University of Nebraska. I am actually a native of Pennsylvania. I grew up in South Central Pennsylvania, down in the Gettysburg area. Went to Penn State for my undergraduate degree in fisheries and wildlife, and eventually, after all my other degrees, moved out to Nebraska, where I currently reside as a faculty member, where I run the AWESOME lab, which is the Applied Wildlife Ecology and Spatial Movement Lab. We're going to briefly talk about wild turkey declines across the USA and how that ties into prescribed fire and habitat management. And then we'll dive a little bit more deeper into the topic of prescribed fire and wild turkeys and how fire can be used to enhance wild turkey habitat. And then lastly, how does this impact you as a land manager? Ultimately, using fire, using other management tools can really be beneficial for wildlife management. But really, how does some of the things we're going to talk about today impact you? So as I mentioned, I run the AWESOME lab out here at UNL. Our focus, because we're in a very ag-dominated state, is providing applicable science to landowners, land management agencies, not only locally in Nebraska, but really nationwide around conservation and intensive ag landscapes. How do we find that balance between ag production and conservation? So you can go follow us on our various social media accounts at AWESOME Lab. You can learn more about some of the habitat management things that we're working on. Actually, today we have a turkey post about our Nebraska wild turkey research project. So if you go and you can learn a little bit more about some of these big movements that these turkeys make in the landscape, and we'll talk about that here at the end of the presentation about thinking about cooperatives and working with your neighbors for wildlife management. All right, so now we're going to make a quick transition. This happened to be one of our turkeys from last year up here in the northwest part of the state of Nebraska. We have a GPS transmitter on, and we were tracking these turkeys across the landscape. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but just a kind of a little filler here as we make that transition. As I mentioned, wild turkeys are declining across the United States. You may personally experience some of this when you think about it from your hunting experiences. I've talked to landowners out here in Nebraska and many other states, and people have noted going from times in which they would see dozens of turkeys to literally in some cases now no turkeys on their properties or on their friends' properties. And so they're asking the questions, well, why? So Mike Chamberlain, who is actually my former PhD advisor, I did a wild turkey research project with Mike looking at the effects of growing season fire on wild turkey nest success and habitat use. He's reported in a study in 2022 that turkey populations have declined by about 3% across states that contributed data to a status update for wild turkeys. And if you are engaged with the National Wild Turkey Federation, Mike has been a noted speaker for them in their past conventions, and has given a State of the Turkey presentation, has actually talked about some of these things. He's also noted in that report, fall and spring harvest have declined between that 2014 and 2019 period by 31% and 12% respectively. And so the point is that the populations are down. And so the question really comes back to, well, why? Here are some poult to hen ratio data collected across a number of states to kind of illustrate that decline. You can all see it's pretty pretty slow or steady decline, I should say, from back in the 80s until current for many states across the nation. Now, there are some places that populations are increasing, but many places, I like to say, are kind of like on various points of that decline of that line. So some may be at the top, some may be further down. The point is, many of the populations we're seeing are declining across the country. So the question is why? This photo is actually I took back at Christmas, just at a property that's right adjacent to my family's property in South Central Pennsylvania. This is one of the woodlots I grew up. I'd actually would deer hunt in this area. And so when you look at this landscape, this is what I see in a lot of places in Pennsylvania. And I spent a lot of time working even as a forestry technician for Dwayne Diefenbach and visiting various places across the north central part of the state as well. And so, like I said, many of the forests look like this, not only in Pennsylvania, but across the United States. And so the question really is, well, what's missing for wild turkeys? And I feel like this little quiz would be a little more impactful if I was actually in person. I could actually poll you guys. But the question is, well, what's missing? When you look at that, you're looking at that forest and saying, well, could turkeys survive in there? Sure, there are some oaks in there. They obviously produce mass. But one of the things I want you guys to get across or really take home from this presentation today is managing for turkeys is really a 365, 366 day approach. It's uh, those areas. Again, no or limited management. So you look at these stands that you experience, you work in on a regular basis. And obviously if you look like this, that can have an impact on the wildlife use. All right, so now let's make a little transition from just kind of talking about turkey declines, kind of thinking about some of these forest stands that we're managing and think a little bit about the ecology of turkeys. Again, Wild Turkeys 365, we're working on a website that's going to be out here in Nebraska, housed out here. It's going to be Upland Game Birds 365, and really thinking about how do we manage our species from that 365 approach. So as I mentioned, turkeys, like many other wildlife, require diverse vegetation types to survive and thrive in that 365-day approach. They require early successional plant communities, and vision is key. And Mark talked about this in his presentation just a moment ago, is when you are looking, get down on the ground, get down on your belly and kind of look out. Can a turkey see through a stand that you're managing or not? Because vision is their key. If they don't have vision, if they can't see, they're not going to be very successful. They're not going to spend a lot of time in that area ultimately because they need to see. That's their form of being able to detect predators on the landscape. And if you hunt turkeys, you know how critical vision is for wild turkeys. They also have a long nesting season, depending on where you're at. Obviously, if you're in some of the southern areas of the country, you can start nesting in March on through. And in cases out here in Nebraska, our median nest initiation dates are in early May. And then we actually had some nests going the whole way out into early August this past season. So they have a long nesting season. In general, most nests do fail. So there is about the standard, if you want to say, of kind of or the consistent number most people throw around is approximately about 20% success for nests right now. And this is against published literature that's out there. And then most broods also fail, a little less than 40% success. And we see that, especially in that first 2 weeks post-hatch, because the first 2 weeks post-hatch for that hen, she's going to remain on the ground with that brood because it's a flightless period. Those birds are trying to thermoregulate, learn how to thermoregulate. They're also, moving. They're trying to consume a lot of resources, high protein resources to get to that stage where they can fly up into a tree and or a shrub or something like that to get off the ground to avoid predation, ground predators. So that just a few little things there just to think about as you're trying to manage for these birds. Turkeys as a whole have evolved with fire and disturbance in the landscape. And what I'll talk about here today, a lot of the information, the study information I'm going to present is really kind of illustrated over time, about a 2 to 4 year return interval. is probably really the best to provide high quality nest and brood rearing cover for these birds. One little caveat, and this is where context is key. Most wild turkey studies to date, it's changing now as a number of other states are building on new studies and developing new studies right now. Most wild turkey studies have been done in the southeastern part of the United States and very pine dominated systems that obviously require that frequent fire. So context is key as you're looking through these results today. I want to make sure I emphasize that because I think it's really important as we talk through some of the subsequent slides. So prescribed fire in wild turkeys. One common question, and these are kind of like four little things I'm going to talk about here in subsequent slides. A question that comes up is direct nest and brood loss. What is that? Should I be burning during the growing season when these birds are nesting on the ground? Do they avoid these burn stands? Does it affect how they're moving and their overall behaviors that they exhibit? And then what scale or size of burn block, is best? And obviously, if you're in wildlife management, we always say it depends, and that's going to be the answer that it's going to come here at the end. But I will give some general guidelines from some of the recent studies that have come out. So does prescribed fire affect nest and brood survival? That's always a question that's asked of me. That's actually what kind of necessitated the need of my PhD research with Mike Chamberlain in Georgia. A lot of landowners are down there. We're doing growing season burns, but there was a lot of questions about, all right, am I burning up those nests? Am I burning up those broods? If the populations are already in decline, why would I want to be burning during those times? And so I want to present some data that Mike has provided to me for the purposes of this presentation today. They collected data on over 622 nests across southeastern states that they've been doing wild turkey studies in over the past several years. Of those 622 nests, 7 of them were affected by fire. So about 1% of those nests were affected by fire. 2 out of those 7 nests actually ended up hatching out. I remember in my own study for my PhD work, we had a handful of nests, which is in this 622, that were impacted by fire. And we actually had a couple of them that ended up surviving, those nests ended up surviving the fire, and the hen was able to hatch out that nest. 137 broods that were monitored. There's only been noted 1 lost to fire from the studies that Mike has compiled over the years. Most of the nests that have occurred on the landscape are in stands that are not scheduled to actually be burned. And that's, I think, an important thing to think about when we're trying to manage for these birds in these stands. And then the fires really were ranging from dormant to early growing season. On average, or these fires are going from about 50 acres on up to 1,200. I would suggest most of that's kind of on the smaller side, based on some of the studies I've been involved in the southeast. And so again, those burn blocks again can kind of range across the spectrum a little bit. But again, the point is that at the end of the day, does prescribed fire affect nest and brood survival? It can, but in this case, and you see it here from 622 nests, you're talking 1% of them being affected by fire. So we're not talking about we're burning all the nests up in the landscape or all the broods that are hatching out there. It's a very, very small proportion of that larger sample that are getting impacted by those fires. The other question is, does time sense fire affect the use of those burns? I mentioned that question earlier. And so data that Mike has also provided me, I think really helps illustrate this point really well. So 80% of the birds that they have monitored, and Mike's been doing both VHF and GPS-based studies, looking at where these birds, what the landscape they're using. 80% of those birds have burns that are available to them. 87% of those use burn stands if they were available. So the birds are selecting for those burn stands. Interestingly, about 14% of the use for turkeys is occurring on the day of that burn. So and I'll show a picture here in a second that will actually help better illustrate that. 38% began to use them within 24 hours post-burn. 68% use within 48 hours, and then 84% use within that 30 days. And so the point is, these birds begin to really shift to utilizing those stands that have just been burned. And within a short period of time, as that new vegetation's coming up, you can see this image here of these couple of birds, and you can see that they've been in a newly burned stand or moving into those areas to find food resources that are available. They also, you can look at that stand and say, well, those birds can see. They can see all over in there because the vegetation is not that high that would preclude them from being able to see. All right, so here's kind of illustrate this 2 weeks prior to fire with some telemetry data. You can see, so the yellow points are the birds' points, and then the pink points are where it's actually roosting. And so we look at this the day of the fire. So the birds spending time away from that burned area. The burned area is noted here in this red boundary, just so you kind of, this is the burn block. Within that, you can see the bird here the day of the fire, spend a little more time closer to, and then 2 weeks after that fire, a significant shift in that use. They're spending a lot of time around the edges, but the point is these birds are shifting to those burned areas. So that fire occurred on the 28th of February. This is what it looked like in early or mid-March. And again, that distance to edge really is important, but as time goes along, that impact is diminished. So another here, but we just use telemetry data to be able to go in there and look at time since fire to the burn blocks and basically conduct a use versus availability analysis. So what we found was that time since fire did not affect habitat selection and that longer term. So again, as the days go by, is that fire affecting their use of those stands? We found that females on average use stands that were about 425 days post-fire. And again, this is from that longer term standpoint, not just that short term that we just discussed, compared to the expected use. The caveat is I was working in a frequent fire system that was burned every 1 to 2 years. So we're talking this property, one property was on 30,000 acres. They're burning about 15,000 acres every year. Their average burn blocks are probably around 50 acres or so, 50 to 100 acres. So they're burning literally from January to December because they got to be able to accomplish a lot within a lot of acreage burn within an essentially short time period throughout the year. But again, the point is you create that patchy mosaic of those burn blocks, I think is really key, and that's what we saw within our study. So looping back here, we talked about this question a little bit ago about it affecting nest success. Does growing season fire affect nest success? Again, 7 out of 622 nests were impacted by fire. Really, it comes down to promoting that herbaceous understory, just as Mark talked about in his presentation, remembering that vision is key for turkeys. Managing for our less frequently burned stands of our hardwoods is also critical, providing that key habitat. Again, 365 approach. I want to continue to emphasize that. We're managing for these birds from a 365-day approach. And also remember to be adaptable, manage and monitor your fire impacts, but also be adaptable. And that was one of the first presentations today, talking about adaptability and thinking about how, how does that fire impact the vegetation? How is it impacting the wildlife that are utilizing that stand? And how can I, as a manager, continue to be adaptable and learn and that's noted here in these green bars here. You can see, and it continues to use declines as the blocks get larger and larger. They also suggested in their paper that burn blocks should not exceed 500 acres if turkeys are your target species for management. I think it's an important thing to think about. You got to think about species ecology. So if you're managing primarily for turkeys, this is kind of one of the recommendations they provided from that paper. But again, thinking about species ecology of what you're focused on is critical with applying any type of management. Additionally, those smaller fires obviously are going to also burn up less of that turkey's home range. So you think about a 500-acre fire, it could consume anywhere from 50+% to over 111% of that turkey's home range during that pre-nesting lane, which is kind of that dormant into the early growing season. And so the point is that thinking about that scale is important when you're thinking about how big your burn block should be. Obviously, it's, if we want to accomplish and want to burn literally thousands of acres, it's a lot easier to have larger blocks. But reality is we want to create that mosaic at a smaller spatial scale. And then I'll finish on this for this slide here on scale and just show or illustrate this point, a quote from their paper. That increased spatial heterogeneity and promoting that diverse vegetation conditions are key. So taking those larger burn blocks and breaking them into smaller units. All right, so now that we talked a lot about the fire impacts for turkeys, I want to kind of end my presentation with a series of a few slides here and just kind of talk about how this can help you as a manager. As we talked about at the beginning, to set the stage, we've seen turkey declines across the country. And so as a manager, how can we address those? Again, how does that impact you and what you're doing on a day-to-day basis? So obviously, one of the things we need to be managing for is nest and brood rearing cover, escape cover. Really, again, 365-day approach. Mark did a really good job, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But again, thinking about that high quality nest and brood rearing cover, because those are probably two of the most limiting factors for most turkey populations, is high quality nest and brood rearing cover. Creating that insect-rich environment for poults is critical. There's that brood rearing component. That first 2 weeks of life is critical, as we talked about, for those birds. We need to be able to get them into the being able to roost in trees, because survival does go up as we get them past that 14-day flightless period. And that requires very high protein, insect-rich environments for those birds to be able to consume and grow rapidly. Here's a little quick video. We did some GoPro work out here in Nebraska to kind of illustrate, brood rearing cover, trying to create, you see that there's openings within there. The birds can move around. They can be able to navigate that. It's not incredibly dense, so that would prevent them from moving about in these patches. And so the point is that you want to be able to create some diversity even within those early successional stands. So here's kind of a comparison of that. So you have on the one side here, the open sparse vegetation and the dense vegetation. Well, if we're managing for broods, we don't want to be managing for that dense vegetation. I don't want patches of brome grass, for example, that are dense and thick, because those birds, they also in the first couple of weeks of life, they're challenged with being able to thermoregulate. So if they get wet, they're going to end up having challenges and they may end up dying of hypothermia. And so the point is we don't want to have really dense stands of vegetation. We want to create those openings in there. So that's where fire plays a significant role in creating that for birds. Mark talked about this. I won't spend a lot of time on it. Obviously, opening up that canopy to get the light on the ground. And then I wanted to highlight a quote out of Mark's study that he just published and he just talked about, is pairing timber management with prescribed fire for turkeys and deer. And what they noted here is that burning during those different seasons, early and late, combined with that timber management, as he talked about, with shelter wood cuts, can provide food and cover resources for both deer and turkey throughout the year. And the point that Mark illustrated is creating heterogeneity. We're constantly creating that heterogeneity in the landscape, so it's benefiting these species that we're managing for. Also, thinking beyond your property boundary. I think that's really key, especially out here in ag-dominated states like Nebraska. But I think it just is a common thing anywhere we live. We want to think about our neighbors and how we can kind of identify strengths and weaknesses of their properties. And I know the National Deer Association talk a lot about this with cooperatives. And that's the point, is we got to be able to manage beyond our property boundary. Unless you have thousands of acres as a land manager. Most people don't. You want to be able to work with your neighbors and kind of identify those strengths and weaknesses and figure out burn regimes that best fit for you and your neighbors, and timber management and other types of habitat management that can benefit wildlife at a broader spatial scale. And that's where, again, I focus a lot on conservation cooperatives. I think it's really key to build that connectivity for wildlife to move from point A to point B. Because if they just see kind of this, biological desert out there, you're not going to see the impact that you potentially could have if you were implementing various management techniques like fire on the landscape. So just to finish up here, wild turkeys, they are inextricably linked to fire and landscape disturbance. And so we want to be able to manage for turkeys using fire, whether that be dormant or growing season. Mark, again, highlighted some of those things earlier in his presentation. Scale is a component of that. So we're managing at a smaller spatial scale for these birds. And we can see that those fires do have a pretty dramatic impact on their use or utilization of those patches within literally days post-fire. So I'll finish up and give this quote. Aldo Leopold is the father of wildlife management. And I like to use this to kind of end my presentations because I think, we live in a society that is instantaneous. You think about your phone, you can get something off of Google quickly within a split second. But conservation takes time. And I think that's the thing, even with fire, you're constantly learning, you're constantly adapting, you're constantly improving your skill set, and then being able to pass that information on to the next generation so they can continue to build on the knowledge that you've been able to learn over decades of your experiences, I think is really, really critical. So with that, I don't know if there's any time for questions. You can go to our website. You can check out Mike Chamberlain's Wild Turkey Lab website. Also, Marcus Lashu, who's speaking tomorrow, has a Wild Turkey Science podcast with Will Goolsby. They have some great information on there. But if you want to reach out to me, here's my email address. Also, you can just follow us at our various social media accounts at Awesome Lab.